tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou koutou. Ko taranaki, taku maanga, ko pātia, taku awa. Ko Ngāti Pākehā, taku iwi. Ko maharangi, taku kaina and aina. Ko Niki Chisnall. It's a great privilege to have been invited to be the opening speaker for this conference, although it's been lovely to hear from the Christchurch people and from Richard and Susan about the journey to excellence. It's a little bit daunting, but I really don't recall all those things I said previously. But anyway, it was the theme of the conference, reflecting on community, that kind of struck me because it fits so well with my philosophy. Because following my first degree, I studied for a further 2 years in the field of community work, and that was where I began my professional life. I always regarded the effort that we put into building community to be so much more fruitful than when we choose to wait and deal with the consequences of the so-called ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Education, and specifically Montessori education, is like community work. It puts the effort into upfront, positive and constructive effort. Dr. Montessori was inspired to make a difference following her observations at the Rome Asylum. She used her scientific ability to research current knowledge and to experiment with new possibilities in inclusive education with children and their teachers. Later, she decided to create a school that could be a community hub within a rather sombre San Lorenzo apartment building. She called it the school within the home. And she encouraged parents to visit and the teacher to live on site as a member of the community. She envisaged a number of other facilities attached to the Casa dei Bambini: a kitchen producing meals for working mothers, a library for the edification of working parents, a club to encourage fathers to stay close to home, an infirmary to enable mothers to keep working whilst children were sick, and really that challenge remains. We haven't quite fulfilled all of those dreams. The phenomenon of that we know as the Casa dei Bambini needed a catalyst, and Dr. Montessori was the initial catalyst. But her approach rapidly inspired a vast group of teachers eager to copy or replicate the experiment. Some caught part of her message: the ordered, well-groomed, good-mannered, clever children emanating from the various casi and schools were an attractive proposition to both teachers and their parents. And this is a photo from the San Francisco exposition where they put children inside a glass box and showed what they could do. However, there were others, perhaps fewer in number, who recognised her greater intent for freedom and social justice. And here you see the children who were free to discover how to read, for example, and to write, all by themselves. And they were children from the slums of Italy. In past presentations, as Anna has said, I've shared a little bit about those radical women. Lily Rubishek from Vienna, and Sylvia Pankhurst from London, Kathleen Lynn from Ireland, Anna Macaroni from Italy. But today, because my opportunities to speak to you again are likely to be limited, I want to return to you, the teachers of Aotearoa. Using the words of Montessori as a young and confident woman in her 40s, and then later during her time in India when she was in her 70s, when she'd gathered a great deal of wisdom through observation of children throughout the world. Montessori saw her approach as both scientific, and I've come back to that more and more as I've reflected, but also as spiritual. And I thought I'd share with you some of her words. And And this following rather poetic passage comes from Spontaneous Activity in the Child, a book she wrote in 1917, and it was a chapter concerning the preparation of the teacher. And you might know that Montessori, after she left the San Lorenzo Kazi, she was actually turfed out, she had a disagreement with Senor Talamo. She went to the Franciscan community in Via Gusti, and she took instruction from the Mother Superior there, who helped her to understand about the Franciscan dream for peace in the world. And through acknowledging both people and our interconnection with all creatures. And so she recalls St. Francis, who called to a little grasshopper who was chirping underneath his window, and he kind of wrote this hymn to all creatures. And he says, "The smaller the creature, the more perfectly does it reveal the power and goodness of the Creator." And because Francis knew how to really look, Montessori quotes his observation. And he says, Who gave me these little fairy feet, furnished with healthy and flexible little bones, to enable me to spring swiftly from branch to branch, from twig to twig? Who further gave me eyes, crystal globes, that revolve and see before and behind, and spy out my enemies, the predatory kite, the black crow, the greedy goose? And he gave me wings, delicate tissues of gold and green and blue, which reflect the colour of the skies and of my trees. And with that detailed observation from Francis, Montessori goes on to say, the vision of the teacher should be at once precise, like that of the scientist, and spiritual, like that of the saint. The teacher should be at once positive, scientific, and spiritual. Positive and scientific because she has an exact task to perform. We've already heard that. She should follow the example of the scientist who takes account of every minute particle of matter. It eliminates all the optical delusions, all the confusion which impurities and foreign substances might introduce into the science of the search for truth. And here we think perhaps about the obstacles that Montessori is always talking about, that we place in the way of the child, these imperfections. And she says, to achieve such an attitude, long practice and wide observation of life under the guidance of the biological sciences is necessary. And you might have thought your studies were over, but here we go. So why does Montessori then say it's not enough simply to be like a scientist, but that the teacher has a spiritual role as well? She even uses the metaphor of the teacher as being like a priest or a priestess, because we're not simply concerned with the material body of the child, but also the child's inner life. And I think we heard about that with regard to the Christchurch children, the trauma that they went through. You had to deal with that, didn't you? Yeah. And that was beautiful. Thank you for bringing that to us. So Montessori says in another chapter, she says, the more that a man's inner life shall have grown normally, organising in itself in accordance with the provident laws of nature and forming an individuality, because we talk about supporting the individual child, don't we? The more richly will he be endowed with a strong will. You all recall that chapter in The Absorbent Mind about the development of the will. And a well-balanced mind. He who is strong is ready. And then she goes on. It's only a vigorous soul that can be prepared for everything. So I guess my message today is about not forgetting the soul of the child. So the child is assisted by the teacher who, like the scientist, has honed his or her ability to observe and then create the sort of environment, the prepared environment that will suit the individual. To act freely, that's what we want, isn't it? The freedom to discover. To make choices, because that's the first deliberate act of the child who is coming to gain control. To engage, because we're looking for those signs of concentration. And then to persist. And persistence, I think, is an interesting one. And persistence with difficulty. And it always struck me that Margaret Carr kind of pulled that out of the strands of pedagogy, that exploration is such a key, and to see children who will persist with a difficult problem and so on is something that we're looking for. It's a sign that children have become engaged and ready for the next step. And it's interesting to read, and again in spontaneous activity, that Montessori talks about this. She says, now the little child who manifests perseverance in his work as the first constructive act of his psychical life, and upon this act builds up internal order, equilibrium, and the growth of personality, demonstrates almost as in a splendid revelation the true manner in which man renders himself valuable to the community, which is what we're all here to reflect upon. Brings us back to this theme. Because we often think of Montessori education as being focused on the individual. Has really actually always been the intent of Montessori education to certainly develop the child with that strong, resilience and the strong will to move forward. But it's also about collaboration and about the child claiming their part as a builder of community. And again, you can go back to the Absorbent Mind to look at that chapter that deals with the child as the kind of underpinning of social cohesion. The child is what brings us together, to focus, to bring the children up. That's what brings the community together. People alluded to that already. Well, how do we do that? Montessori refers to the human tendency and sensitivity towards order. She says, in all things, social as well as others, it is organisation and order which makes it possible to proceed rapidly. Putting all the images of consciousness in order. The child has so much information bombarding into this life. She says the little child of 3 carries within him a heavy chaos. But by means of our sensory exercises, we make it possible for a child to distinguish and classify. So classification and a sense of deeper perception and connection with the elements of the world. Yes, but much more. The sense of order provides the child with the opportunity to reach out and to make decisions and choices, deliberate acts that strengthen the inner will. We need Montessori's special approach to reach the child. In her the lectures that she delivered in India to so many teachers, she talks about the teacher who is transformed, who finds in this work a new love, a new thrill in her work. And she says that, this kind of teacher stays hours after the school is closed. And it's a problem because in Italy, where she came from, the authorities were not at all happy with teachers extending their hours. But I think you probably all relate to that, do you? How many hours have you spent? Extra hours after class, just thinking about what you're going to prepare for the next day, thinking about new lessons. And Montessori says new food for the soul of the child. And I think you all relate to that. So the great discovery is that the teacher is also capable of undergoing a change with the help of the child. It's a collaboration. These changes in the soul of the teacher have often led to great changes in her life. And Montessori says many teachers have left off the things that seemed of importance to them. Many of them have cried and said it's impossible for us to go back to the old methods, and I have heard that time and time again from students at AUT. They go out on a practicum in a Montessori centre, and we couldn't possibly ever go back to mainstream. We could never teach in that old way again. So this is really the cooperation between the soul of the child and the soul of the teacher. Both souls, as Montessori says, are now free, and both have reached the same peak. And when I talk about a critically engaged pedagogy, it's that engagement that I'm talking about. Okay? However, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Paul, is he around? Yeah, great, to come up at this point, because we're going to have a little chat about it, so you can kind of settle. We often come across children where this kind of romantic vision almost just doesn't seem to be working. Can you all think of those children that we struggle with? It is an ideal. It's out there and we strive for it. It's a vision. But we have to work hard to get there. Montessori reminds us of the obstacles that we place in the way of children's development towards equilibrium and the kind of unity that she calls normalization. And actually, if you want some inspiration, I found this really old book, came out in 1947. Don't know whether any of you have read it, but it's about a little boy. He was 5, I think, when he came to Virginia. Axling, who's the author. And he had huge obstacles placed in his way. He'd been rejected by both of his parents, who were scientists and didn't really want him in their lives, and interrupted things. And it's called Dibs in Search of Self. And the interesting story in here is that it took only 1 hour a week by a very skilled therapist, teacher, whatever you like to call her, who prepared an environment that gave him stability. And she, as he came into that environment, originally he had crawled around his preschool and he wouldn't talk, he was mute, deliberately. And they thought he was mentally retarded. And she supported him to make his own choices and decisions. Exactly what you're doing as Montessori teachers. And over the course of several weeks, he gradually found the courage to reveal his true self. as Axline said, Dibs is the only real person I ever met in the classroom who could teach me what it means to be a complete person. And so eventually they found out he actually had an IQ of well over 160, so he wasn't at all retarded. Well, earlier this year, Paul and I began to discuss and reflect upon a particular child who seemed to be standing apart from the rest of the children. And Paul at this time was finishing his thesis on respectful relationships in Montessori education. And you're going to hear more about that later in the conference. But for now, we thought we might just, I don't know how much time have we got? Whatever? Okay. We just thought, well, I thought, and Paul very kindly agreed, that we might continue our conversation in front of you, which is a bit daunting, just because, you know, to show you what I mean about being critically engaged. And I don't think it's anything huge, but it just means bringing your knowledge, all your knowledge. You've all studied a lot, haven't you? And you've studied children, you've observed children, you have great knowledge, and bringing that to the fore to kind of solve the problems that we face with these children who stand apart or stand out, who stand aside. And this is the child that you'll all be able to think of, because they're the ones who cause us concern. And as we seek that connection with the soul of the child, we sometimes seem to misfire. I know I've shared similar stories in the past, but once again, I think if we keep questioning and also keep faith with the child, we will continue to make progress. Okay, so Paul, all right? You're cool. Tell me a wee bit about this child.
This child didn't display the typical normalised behaviours or typical behaviour of any child her age or at stage of development. She stood out as a student. She stood out from the teachers, and it was fairly obvious to her classmates that she was also displaying different behaviours.
Okay, so, and when did she come into the class? How old was she?
She was close to 4.
Okay, so that, again, you know, you can start thinking about that. Do you remember, we talked about, the way she was kind of out of step with the others? What kind of stood out for you?
She stuck to one part of the classroom and stuck to one particular activity. So it was very hard for us to encourage her to do other activities in the room. And over time, she's isolated herself socially from the other students.
So that became a continuing kind of issue? Or,
yeah.
So she came at the beginning of the year or earlier last year?
Yep, it was a while ago.
Okay.
She was just over 3.
Oh, okay. So she's been here quite a while. Okay. So she's established quite a concern for you.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. And we talked. I think when we first talked at the beginning of the year, I think I asked you about her family situation. Is that something that you've done, a bit more about, or?
Yeah, it's something her mother came in and had meetings with us, and also her grandmother came in and had meetings with us. They revealed certain aspects of her home life that helped us to understand how she was.
I'm glad you told me in the past. Sounds like progress. One of the things I was really interested to hear, Kathleen mention that you went to visit all the families in your preschool, and that's something I used to do when I ran a centre. Was at the beginning of every child's induction, part of that would be a home visit, and so finding out about, just finding out about the child in their own situation is enormously valuable, and I would recommend that. It's very time consuming, but once you get it going, it's not too bad, and it just reaps huge rewards. So so being able to visit with the family and them coming in to talk to you is great. So you found, I think, a little bit about perhaps not quite so much this constancy in her life. Is that an issue?
We found out there wasn't a lot of consistency and there wasn't a lot of order in her physical environment and in terms of her routine and who was caring for her. So we assumed that her life was quite muddled, I'd say would be a good word.
So the importance of kind of this holistic framework comes to mind. So what's happened since the beginning of term since I talked to you last?
We've definitely seen positive progress. I mean, we're working very hard with her and speaking with her family. Now she will start to explore sort of both sides of our two rooms in our environment, and she will actually come up and ask if we can teach her something new, something she's never seen before. So she's definitely exploring the environment.
So she's just one of those children that's taking extra time. Yeah. And we need to remember that, every child is on a different timetable. So this child is, she's finding her way.
Finding her way.
Yeah, that's great. And what about the other children? Are they helping her?
The other children are helping her a lot. They don't react to her, how do I put it nicely? Funny behaviour. If she has a little performance in front of the children, they most of the time sort of sit still and look at her as if I'm not really sure what you're doing here. And a lot of the time we just all sort of sit still and she finishes and then goes and sits down again and carries on.
So have you done any particular kind of grace and courtesy or modelling or whatever that helps?
Lots of grace and courtesy. And lots of breathing deeply and counting to 10. And just observing that little bit longer to see if either herself or the other children can help her with what is happening at that time. But lots of grace and courtesy.
I remember from last conference that there was an example given of a child who had, and it was grace and courtesy that kind of took them through, and just movement exercises sometimes can help. And one of the things I wondered, and I put this question, Paul probably doesn't even know what I'm meaning, I don't know, did you catch it? I said, have you done a Franciscan observation on this child? Did you know what I meant by that?
Do you mean, have we looked a little bit deeper into her particular?
Well, just what are her really, really wonderful attributes? Sometimes we focus on the really hard things about children, and we forget about the beauty of the child. So what's this child? What are her?
The beauty of this child is that she will show us exactly how we are treating other people in the class. She knows, she can tell everybody else in the class exactly what is the right thing to do, may not display it herself, and she will use exactly the same language that we use with her and with other children. So she's our guide to knowing if we are saying things correctly, positively, in the right manner.
So there you go. Isn't she wonderful?
She is.
I think it's to eat. Right. I think you're going to. these children who stand apart. And we're also going to hear from Connie Black and from Jamie Rowe over the course of the conference to give you lots more to think about. But I would like to leave you with the thought that critically engaged pedagogy involves employing the skill of the scientist, but also the contemplation and open reflection of the saint. And I wish you well and hope you gain a great deal from this gathering of our Montessori community.
It's my very great pleasure not only to give thanks to Nikki for her keynote today, but also to give her thanks for her decades of contribution to Montessori education. I've asked Susan and Willow, who were her students at AUT in the early days of the degree and who have been part of her PhD research, to come and stand with her so she doesn't feel so lonely up there while I'm going to say all these things. We sent out word that we would like to honour Nikki at this conference, and I have been inundated with emails from people around the world. And tributes have been sent from colleagues from early days of Montessori in Wellington and from friends and neighbours who raised their children alongside Nikki and Dave. There are tributes from teachers who had the opportunity to work with Nikki at Montessori centres and schools in Northland, and Nainai, and Nio, and Johnsonville. Thanks and tributes from teachers in our professional community in New Zealand who have sought and received support from Nikki over the last 3 decades. Tributes from her colleagues in tertiary institutions in New Zealand and Montessori colleagues from overseas. And heartfelt thanks from the many, many students who were guided by Nikki in their development as Montessori educators. Giving people the opportunity to express in writing the acknowledgement of Nikki's impact on their personal and professional life has been done at short notice, and with the aim of keeping this a surprise for Nikki. Tributes have been received from over 60 people, and the word count has reached 16,000 words, which is far more than I give Nikki for her quarterly column in Montessori Voices. I especially want to thank Nikki's daughter, Jenny Stott, who lives in London. Jenny has not only assured me that this was a good idea, but she was able to get to work on Facebook to contact teachers and fellow students from Montessori days in New Zealand.
Keep sending Facebook.
Yes.
I keep hiding them.
Jenny is so proud of her mother and has made her own contribution to this collection of tributes. Acknowledgement has also been made to Nikki's husband Dave Stott, who has played his own and very significant role in the Montessori movement in New Zealand. And Dave also assured me that this was a good idea, and I do hope he was right. Years ago, I remember Nikki shared with us that she had done a count of the number of times the word love appeared in Dr. Montessori's writings, and I cannot remember the amount, but I just recollect that it was a lot. I decided to do a word analysis of the tributes that people had made, because I'm really into quantitative things. And she has been described as kind and respectful and passionate, as well as dedicated, challenging and reflective, but the word most used was inspiring and closely followed by supportive. Nikki has contributed in so many ways through her teaching, her research, her writing and her leadership, but it seems that the most important thing that Nikki has done has been to share her love. In 2006 in Nelson, Nikki suggested, so that is the task, to look at your centre or school and see how you have set it up to receive and use the energy of love. To me, Nikki exemplifies how to use the energy of love. She has taken Montessori philosophy and not only applied it in a classroom setting, but embodied Montessori in her daily life. Nikki, we wish you to know that not only what you have done, but most importantly who you are and how you live your life has been an inspiration to us all. Nikki, our tributes are our act of love, which we hope that you will receive.
Happy